My costume was a little too morbid for church this morning. So there was a bit of a last-minute call there. But it's so good to be here today. Thank you so much for that introduction at the beginning, because we're going to be talking a bit about welcome. So when I was reading over the gospel this week, I was struck by two questions. One was a silly question. The other was a serious question. So I'm going to start with the silly question. We have a reading today about a man who climbed a tree to see Jesus. Could I remember the last time I climbed a tree? I think I must have been 10 or 11 or so. I remember I tripped, and I think this was the summer, because the branch caught me under my shirt, and I got this big cut on myself, and it was horrible. And I was thinking, what would it take for me as an adult to climb a tree, to get sap all over my clothes and twigs and leaves in my hair, get all scratched up from the bark? When would I ever want to climb a tree? But of course, I'm a bit tall, so I don't have the same issue as Zacchaeus. But still, Zacchaeus was a grown adult. He had a job as a tax collector, and he was probably pretty busy. I do wonder, what was it that Zacchaeus had heard about Jesus that made him want to take time out of his day to climb a tree? What rumors did Zacchaeus hear about this young, unmarried carpenter from Nazareth? What did Zacchaeus hear? For context, it couldn't have just been that Jesus performed miracles or healed people, because Zacchaeus lived in a time where there were lots of fortune tellers and miracle workers and witch doctors and prophetic figures all around. What was different about this Jesus? So friends, this is the second and the more serious question I have from this gospel. Often I have to ask myself this same question. Why Jesus? What is it about Christ that makes you want to climb a tree in your heart? Our lives are short. We have so many obligations and responsibilities, and there's no shortage of gurus and organizations and activities and political groups, sports teams, ideologies, so many things to occupy us. What makes Jesus different? Now, I can't read Zacchaeus' mind, but I think I have an idea why Zacchaeus would have taken time out of his busy day to potentially hurt or embarrass himself by climbing a tree. It's the same reason that makes Jesus different from every other thing in my life. Jesus was the one who welcomed me and who loved me when nobody would. Throughout the ministry of Jesus, in the mission of the disciples, throughout the lives of the saints, we see this over and over again. God chooses the ones that we do not expect. God chooses the ones that we actively pass over. God welcomes when others do not, and he gives this strange, overwhelming love, asking for nothing in return. But for so many of us, when we're given this love, all we can do is give. Zacchaeus immediately wanted to be able to offer his home and his fortunes when he was looked in the eye and brought forward. The term I've heard for this kind of welcome is radical hospitality. So usually when I hear the word hospitality, I think of hotels, I think of cruises, I think of people who are paid to smile at me and take my order. But Jesus' radical welcome is so much more than that. It's hospitality that's more like a hospital than it is a hotel. It's a place where you are taken in, where you are cared for in your most vulnerable state, and you are healed to be that person made whole the way that God has made you to be. So in the gospel story, Jesus is coming to town, and there is so much attention, there is so much buzz for Jesus that crowds are lining up to get a glimpse of this carpenter from Nazareth. So in addition to the 12 disciples, Jesus has lots of followers, all sorts of people who have given up their previous lives to follow this Jesus. You must imagine that this is probably like the circus is coming to town. This is a huge popular band. People are hearing about this ahead of time. They're lining up. Jesus is not just a visitor, he is an event. But when Jesus does come into town, instead of paying attention to the tall people at the front of the crowd, instead of hobnobbing with the who's who, Jesus notices the funny man hiding in the tree, the man who is a tax collector, and Jesus immediately welcomes him into his circle and trusts him. People start to grumble. Not only is Jesus focusing on this funny little man and trusting him, this Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Now, the big deal about tax collectors, of course, in those day and age, is that it's a little bit different from the way that we do taxes now. When I pay my taxes, I admittedly do a little bit of grumbling, but I like NPR. I like my roads without potholes. I realize this is going for something. But for the Jewish folks in this area of Palestine, of Israel, taxes were a little bit different because they were being colonized by Rome. Rome was this faraway power that spoke a different language, that had troops in the streets. And Rome selected some of the people, some of the Jewish folks in that area to be the tax collectors. And that's something that, colonial powers have always done. They've always singled out certain people from within the conquered group to be the ones that get to do the dirty work. And those are the ones who get rich. So folks were not super happy about the tax collectors because they were traitors in their eyes. In addition to that, the tax collectors were known to do a little skimming off the top. So Zacchaeus was probably pretty loaded. He probably had a nice house. No wonder Jesus wanted to go to it. But notice that Jesus doesn't chastise Zacchaeus in front of everybody. He doesn't lecture him about how he was hurting his community. Jesus saw him hiding in the tree, and he gave him a hand. Suddenly, the crowd starts to complain. They are disappointed. Isn't this Jesus supposed to be our hero? They grumbled louder. Isn't this Jesus supposed to be the one that would defeat this Roman army that's been destroying our community and our livelihood? They just kept grumbling. If he's really the Messiah, then why is he mingling with one of our enemies? Now, friends, I know that I am a grumbler. I complain way too much. Had I been in that crowd, I probably would have been upset that Jesus was not paying attention to me. Because I know in my heart, if somebody scares me or I feel like somebody is hurting me, I don't want anything to do with them. I am not always hospitable. I am not always welcoming. So there's another story this morning about hospitality too, within the Isaiah reading, where it mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is a reference to the book of Genesis, where there's the story of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, who was passing through the town of Sodom and Gomorrah with his family. And a group of angry men came to attack Lot's family, threatening intimate violence against Lot and his kin. God rescues Lot's family, while destroying the cities as a punishment. Throughout Christian history, many have interpreted the story as being against LGBT people. They've interpreted it by thinking that God destroyed these cities for the alleged sin of being gay, of being queer. However, throughout this reading, we can see that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was a lack of hospitality. The hordes of men threatening great violence against an outsider like Lot. They were going against every single notion of hospitality and welcome that we have throughout the Bible. As Isaiah writes, God is sick of the city's burned offerings, sick of the displays of humility, but not the actual practice of public love. The reading says, "Even though you make your prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." And I think it's important to remember that widow in this context doesn't just mean someone whose husband died. It also means single mothers. We have no idea where a lot of these men ended up. Things are complicated, and there are lots of widows that need help. This is the irony of Sodom and Gomorrah, this parable about God's virtues of hospitality get warped into a story to exclude and marginalize LGBT people, many of whom are the most vulnerable folks in our society. The organization Trans Equity produces the largest and most comprehensive survey of transgender people in the United States. Their last full survey was taken in 2015, and just this month they've begun their 2020 survey. In the 2015 survey, they identified that a full 30% of all transgender people have experienced homelessness. About a fifth have reported being rejected by their faith communities. Almost all the LGBT people that I know have lived with this deep, unsettling fear that the people most closely around them, their families, their communities, their places of worship, their friends, will all reject them. It is so, so heavy. But what's funny about all of this is that some of the greatest examples of love and hospitality, of welcome, have come from queer communities. We see stories of the lesbians who cared for the young men dying of AIDS in the 1980s and 90s, when many doctors and nurses wouldn't even touch somebody with that condition. I have seen how our LGBT communities will go to great lengths to welcome people of different backgrounds and experiences and do everything to help folks out of homelessness, out of family rejection, to be the first ones to go shopping with you for clothes that make you feel safe. Queerness and hospitality. We are a people who are united in our experience of being different from our families of origin. And with that pain and tension, we are able to create communities of radical welcome. As Jesus says in this reading, "For the Son of Man has come to seek out and save the lost," not grumble, not run away, not give in to our fears, not to judge, but to come and see us just exactly as how we are, to let us be healed. So how can we learn from Jesus? How can we avoid the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah? How do we be hospitable in our communities and in our lives? I think so often churches think that they need something big and splashy to attract people, like a coffee shop, a basketball court, a big band, a smoke machine. But instead of asking, how can we advertise to make people excited to be here? What if we were to ask, how can we welcome the people who are already looking for a home. These are the people who are in the trees, waiting to peek in, wanting to hear about this Jesus, to hear about the God who welcomes them when no one else will. So at the beginning of the sermon, I posed a silly question about climbing trees. But the more that I think about this, maybe it isn't so silly. Well, I haven't climbed a literal tree to hear about this Jesus. I've snuck into the back of churches. I've secretly listened to radio shows and podcasts about Jesus because I was wanting to learn more. I've gone into my closet to pray in silence when I was afraid because I just wanted to listen and to understand Jesus when I was lonely and when I was scared that I would be rejected for being the wrong kind of person. And why did I want to find Jesus? Because I knew in my heart he had already set a place for me at the table, a place to belong, a place